That was fantastic. So many good nuggets in that conversation, but I will always remember Kayla saying the eggheads on X with no name. We've all met them. All right, our next guest is leading the charge in changing the narrative around investing to build a thriving, sustainable Indigenous economy across Turtle Island by placing Indigenous communities, traditional knowledge, and values at the core of the solution. They aim to redefine what lasting impact truly means. Please welcome General Partner at Raven Capital, Althea Wishloff, in conversation with the President and CEO of the Canadian Council for Aboriginal Business, Tabatha Bull. A big warm welcome.
Ani, hello. Welcome. So we're going to dig right in because we don't have a lot of time. But first, Ani, Tabatha Indigenous Nipissing Indigenous Mijisedo Dem. It's a pleasure to be here. I've just introduced myself in Anishinaabe-Moan, which is our language, and it's my way of honoring that we're here, and I'm here actually as a visitor to Toronto. I'm a member of Robinson Huron Treaty, so I too am visiting here, and I'm honored to be able to work and play and live in what is now called Toronto. And I'll let you introduce yourself. We won't go over the bios because we want to get into the real conversation, but Althea, it's a pleasure to be here with you.
Thanks, Tabatha. Hi, everyone. Althea Wishloff wa'e lax giskas ne t'em wilps hapagwat. My name is Althea Wishloff. I'm a member of the Gitsan First Nation. Through my mom and my grandma do I get my clan, which is the Fireweed clan, and I'm the House of Hapagwat. As our introducer mentioned, I'm a general partner at Raven.
Great. So I'm really excited to be able to be here, and thank you to Elevate and Lisa for inviting the conversation around Indigenous economy and investment. Before we dig into some of the questions, I want to set a bit of context about Indigenous economy, Indigenous business. So Indigenous businesses are being created in this country 9 times the rate of non-Indigenous businesses. There are over 75,000 Indigenous businesses in the country, in every sector of every size, every province and territory. And just to set a little stats around investment. So we recently did a survey with over 1,000 Indigenous businesses, and 2 out of 5 of those businesses reported that finance and equity, access to equity and capital, is a significant hindrance to their growth. RBC also recently released some stats around Indigenous entities borrowing at the same rate, if they were borrowing at the same rate as non-Indigenous entities' access to capital in Canada, there'd be an immediate deployment of $80 million. And First Nation Financial Management Board has reported that First Nation and Inuit-owned businesses previously accessed only 0.2% of the available credit in Canada and 11 times less market-based capital than comparative Canadian firms. And then Indigenous businesses face a finance gap of approximately $30 billion. So we definitely know that there's a need in the country and a need of Indigenous business. Beyond filling the need, can you share a little bit more about the purpose and vision of Raven Capital?
Absolutely. So Raven Capital is the first venture fund to exclusively focus on investing in Indigenous, as defined as First Nations, Inuit, Métis, and Native American, Alaska Native, and Native Hawaiian-led businesses. We do so across what are colonially known as Canada and the US. The firm was founded 5 years ago now. We're deploying out of our second fund, and the founding story of Raven was really born out of the idea that, to some of those stats, Indigenous peoples are the fastest growing and the highest growth of new businesses here in Canada, and yet there had been no venture funds focused on this space to be able to provide culturally competent capital to these people groups. We're now investing out of our second fund, which is $110 million, for which approximately 55% will go to businesses based here in Canada, and 45% will go towards businesses based stateside.
So can you talk a little bit more about, there not being any venture capital funds focused on Indigenous business, and why is that important? Why is it important to have that specific focus?
Yeah, absolutely. So, we saw a lot of Indigenous businesses being spun up, and back to the commentary around the lack of access to traditional financial systems, they were left with a few options. Try to bootstrap that business, subsist off revenues, try in some way to get friends and family capital, which we know is not always accessible to our communities, maybe take on debt at predatory rates, or close down and not be able to operate. And so, the idea of having a venture fund that will invest at that early stage that has Indigenous people on the team to be able to say, and many of us are founders as well, to say, we've been in this place, we want to help and support you, and we want to do it in such a way that retains Indigenous ownership. We were talking about this earlier. There are so many constraints on Indigenous businesses. And one thing that a lot of Indigenous businesses care about is ensuring that they maintain 51% ownership to be able to access certain programs or whatever it is. Procurement, which we were also talking about. And the wonderful thing about Raven is that in that it is Indigenous-led and owned, every investment we make in Canada sits on the capitalization table as Indigenous ownership, and so is accretive to that mission.
I think the other thing I've talked to about some of the businesses that Raven is an investor in is that Indigenous values and ensuring that they can keep the values principles about their business in line, and the benefit that it is to have someone like Raven understand those values. Are you seeing that also?
It's a big part of what we do. It's worthwhile mentioning that, yes, we are a venture fund. Yes, we have a fiduciary obligation to our limited partners, our investors, but we're also an impact fund, and we have that same impact duty to our limited partners, to our community, to our peoples. And that was part of the initial offering that we made as Raven is, look, yes, we're structured as a venture fund. Yes, we primarily make equity investments. But at the same time, part of our diligence is ensuring that, this business, however they define their impact, and many of them define their impact by aligning with an article of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, we want to be there to support them and uplift them however they see impact. And some companies see impact as follows. They see, an Indigenous or Native American CEO, or someone that's the most senior leader at this organization, and that platform being sufficient to say, like, look at the impact I'm driving. I'm having all of these Indigenous young people see an Indigenous CEO for the first time. Other Indigenous companies are, define their impact as, look, I'm going to donate profits, or I'm going to establish a scholarship fund. But I think one of the things about Raven that makes me really humbled to work there and humbled to work within our impact framework is that we allow for those different narratives such that these Indigenous people don't feel constrained to whatever is somebody else's definition of impact.
Yeah, and I think that, that comes to the definition of Indigenous business as well, which we were talking about a little bit. Mm-hmm. There are Indigenous businesses that, as you said, and a number of them do give back to community or do have scholarship funds or programming, but I think there are some areas in which we're putting up additional barriers to be defined as a business because you have to have some way of giving back. And really, for Indigenous young people to see in a successful Indigenous CEO like Bobby Reset, who was here, that has impact on future generations in itself. So when Raven's looking at who is an Indigenous business, what kind of other things are you thinking about?
Yeah. So as far as our investment parameters, we look for a senior leader at an organization that comes from one of those 6 Indigenous groups that I mentioned initially. But I wholly agree. I know we were talking about this downstairs. I'll share 2 stories. So one of the co-founders of Raven in his early career was doing impact investing in sub-Saharan Africa. And he talks frequently about, the mission starts out as a fantastic mission. You want to support underrepresented group. But more often than not, you then expect said underrepresented group to do all of these other things. You place these restrictors. You say, okay, no, you can't be a for-profit business. That means that you don't really care, do you? Or, you have to maintain this level of ownership, or you have to employ this number of other underrepresented people from your same group. And if you're already an under-resourced community, what does it say to then have other people say, I will give you capital only subject to these conditions, when other traditionally afforded opportunity groups do not have those same constraints? So the second analogy and story we were talking about downstairs is it was last year, I went to go see this documentary, some of you might know the one I'm talking about, that was all about the philanthropic sector and about how, when you work in philanthropy, it's kind of expected that you pay your employees terribly because they're doing the good work. It's kind of expected that you're not going out and doing these marketing campaigns. In fact, you're restricted on what percentage of your budget can go towards marketing. Imagine if we constrained for-profit businesses in that way. Like, understandably, that sector of our economy would not thrive. The same goes for the Indigenous economy. Increasingly, are these Indigenous entrepreneurs facing arbitrary barriers as already an under-resourced group that others do not have?
Yeah, I mean, the employment...
Thank you, I'm glad you agree.
We are seeing that often. I mean, the employment requirement, there used to be a requirement in federal government procurement here in Canada that to be considered an Indigenous business, 33% of your staff had to be Indigenous.
Yeah.
And that is, a significant barrier, particularly when the infrastructure for education for Indigenous people is not the same. So we really need to look at the entire ecosystem in order to ensure that we're able to meet those requirements and ensure that we can continue to grow the Indigenous economy and celebrate those businesses as they are deserved. So we talk about that, about like the ecosystem. It's not just about investment, it's not just about financial capital, but for us, we're also seeing it's about social capital. It's just as important to have those networks available to you. And at CCIB, that's work that we're trying to do to create those networks. But if I think about my own boys, we live here in Toronto, the people that they know or the parents of their friends from hockey or lacrosse or whatever are in these whole other circles that when I grew up, I didn't have those circles of access. So if I wanted to start a business now, if my kids want to start a business now, they have all these other people they could ask for help. So social capital is definitely something else I think that we need to really focus on. What else are you seeing in the ecosystem that you think is required?
Culturally competent capital, folks that understand the lived experience of being an Indigenous person and recognizing there are lots of lived experiences being Indigenous peoples, and being able to, welcome who you are as an individual, being part of how you show up at work, I think is really key. One of the things, and it's kind of related, but somewhat of an extension to this question, is ensuring that systematically, it's not just Indigenous people advocating for ourselves, but that there's also regulatory policy changes and processes in place such that Indigenous people are also afforded that opportunity. I know we talked earlier about the federal government setting targets for the amount of Indigenous businesses in their procurement targets. And we also talked about CCIB's marketplace. We talked about having that be a real convener to be able to uplift these Indigenous businesses. Would you say, in your experience, what are some stories from that marketplace?
Yeah, so thank you. It's now my interview. I think definitely pushing really hard for that minimum 5% at federal government procurement. And part of that is, so the capital is there, the business is established, but then we need to make sure that the opportunities are there and that those access to opportunities are available. And that's the same for corporate as well. So we see a lot of corporations who are making a similar 5% procurement, but pieces that need to be put into the place and through our marketplace in order to be a buyer in an Indigenous marketplace, you also have to have someone on your team who Indigenous businesses can reach out to directly. Because we all know that procurement systems and procurement places and organizations are layered with a number of people. So as you said, there needs to be advocates who are focused on ensuring that they're also working towards a target. And measurement and reporting is incredibly impactful as well. So it wasn't really until the federal government made commitments on reporting on meeting the 5% that we really started to see movement there. So those type of things in the ecosystem, and procurement is such an easy way for people to have an impact on the Indigenous economy because it's money you're already spending. It's not an additional line on your budget, and for federal government, it's not additional tax dollars. It's money you're already spending. You just need to look at and move it towards a place that can have a bigger impact. So procurement for sure. And then we talked too about in the U.S. and some of the differences between the U.S. and Canada, and in some ways, the way that grants are working also prevents some barriers. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So I reside now in Lenapehoking in New York City. I lead Raven's US practice, and there are very fundamental differences the way that Indigenous businesses are afforded or not afforded opportunity here in Canada versus the way Native businesses are afforded or not afforded opportunity stateside. We were talking earlier that in Canada, I described it as there's more social recognition of Indigenous people. We had our National Commission of Truth and Reconciliation. We recently had Orange Shirt Day this past Monday. In general, I would say there is more awareness of the history of Indigenous peoples in this country. Stateside, they've not had the equivalent of the TRC. There's not that social recognition, but what the US is always great at is capitalism. And so what's different is that if you are a Native-owned business stateside, you are afforded what I would say is federal contracting dollars. In most cases, if you're a Native American person, you own 51% of your company, you incorporate, you in theory could start generating $1 million in consulting revenue a year because of the systems in place to allow you to get there just as a Native-owned business alone, which is great if you would like to evolve and exclusively be a consulting business. But what that stifles innovation for is a lot of these programs actually prohibit you from taking equity capital. And they also position you to be more of a consulting business, which is not suited for venture. So systematically, the US has stifled equity investment in Native-led businesses, or rather, they've prescribed that you can really only be consulting firms. The same isn't really true in the US, in Canada, where, like I said, we've got the social recognition, and we're only starting to get those programs that really support the commercial success of the Indigenous businesses.
Yeah, definitely even from like granting programs and looking at Indigenous ecosystem government-wide, I think we still have some work to do there. A lot of the programming is still within Indigenous relations and government versus a government-wide strategy on innovation and those type of programming. We're seeing the same. So I want to talk a little bit more. We have about 2 minutes left. You mentioned TRC, and I hope everybody took some time on Monday to really reflect on TRC and on the 94 calls to action. Number 92 is really focused around business and corporations and what corporations can do, and procurement is definitely one of them. We also really see Canadians wanting to see what corporations are doing and also coming to us asking about investment. So Canadians that have additional funds want to look for Indigenous business to invest in, or want to ensure that the money that they're investing in a corporation, that corporation's doing good work with Indigenous people. Are you seeing that? Are there opportunities for Canadians to look to invest in Indigenous businesses?
Absolutely. You vote with your dollars. Tabatha, who are you wearing?
So, procurement alone, beyond investment, we always say to buy Indigenous. And that's, whether you're at your workplace or at home or your personal purchases, there are Indigenous businesses in every sector. So I'm wearing Leslie Hampton, Indigenous designer here. Cheekbone Beauty on my face, and these are Cici Bakwat Beading, who is my niece, but she has a little business also, beading. I think, and there are Indigenous business everywhere. Can you recommend a few for people?
Absolutely. So I am wearing Indie City. Somebody asked me earlier if these glow in the dark. Sadly, they do not, but they are equally as fabulous as if they did. I'll share a few companies and I guess situations where you might look to purchase something from these companies. So Anine is a company founded by Chelsea Marie Petit. If you are, I assume many of you traveled here, you're looking for Travel wear, loungewear, she has fantastic matching sets, AANIIN. Another one that I'll recommend if you're interested in streetwear, Section 35 is led by Justin Jacob Lewis. If you saw their Roots collab earlier this year, it was those fantastic bomber jackets. They had passport holders, all of those things. Love that one. Cheekbone Beauty is one of the investments in Raven's portfolio company, the first Indigenous company to be in Sephora. I personally love their multi-use pencils. If you're in the market for that, go get that. If you've ever seen Reservation Dogs, which I highly recommend, it's a great TV show, featured on that show was Joey Montoya's company called Urban Native Era. They do these fantastic caps, sweaters that say you are on native land, also beautiful hummingbird designs. And then lastly, as we get into the fall season, if you are looking for a blanket for your home, if you're purchasing a gift for a friend's wedding, a baby shower, whatever it is, Trish and her co-founder Mel have this wonderful business called Mini Teepee that I highly, highly recommend.
Yeah. So I think to say that there are a significant number of incredible Indigenous businesses out there to invest in or buy from. Thank you so much for being here. It was such a pleasure to have a conversation.